Excellent. Are we good to go, Jonathan?
Yep.
All right,
Please go.
fantastic. Good afternoon. My name is Professor Tommy J. Ciurria. I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. I'm a Black man with Black and increasingly gray hair, wearing a navy blue blazer and a navy blue shirt. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Mich Ciurria. Over the last several years, I've come to follow Dr. Ciurria's research on disability and complexities and intersectionality with great interest and great fascination. Dr. Ciurria completed her PhD at York University in 2014 and has held prestigious postdoctoral fellowships at Washington University, St. Louis, and the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Her research interests include ethics, social psychology, and epistemology, as well as Marxist feminism and critical disability theory. She is the author of an intersectional feminist theory of moral responsibility, which was published by Routledge in 2019. Today, she will discuss disability, ableism, class, and chronic fatigue. And for those of you who have just joined for this session, please remember that there's a CC button in the lower right-hand corner for people who may want to toggle different text messages. Thank you so much. I now turn it over to Dr. Ciurria.
Thank you, Tommy. Let me just share my presentation. Okay, here we go. Okay, so I am, first of all, I am a white person with medium length Black hair and a Black shirt, and I'm against the backdrop of a bookshelf. And I would like to thank Shelley for inviting me to participate in this conference. I'm very honored to be here today, and I consider this conference to be a pillar of crip culture in academic philosophy. So it is a bit of a refuge for me. I always love presenting here. Today I'm going to be presenting on disability, ableism, class, and chronic fatigue. Okay, so let me get started. So in this presentation, I will identify and explain some of the exclusions that I and other people with myalgic encephalomyelitis chronic fatigue syndrome, or MECFS, confront, including restricted access to government-issued disability benefits, rejected requests for accommodations, and limited acceptance by the disabled community. I will argue that Marxist feminism lends insight into how we can best respond to the economic, social, cultural, and political exclusions that people with MECFS must navigate. In my view, an adequate response to these exclusions must explicitly address the capitalist scarce resources mindset that leads to the gatekeeping of MECFS in particular and disability in general. Finally, I will argue that post-work imaginaries both trouble, to use Judith Butler's term, the capitalist definition of disability as a productivity impairing pathology, that is a pathology that positions the disabled body as an economic and moral risk, and destabilize the ability-disability binary that privileges the non-disabled subject. Because ambiguously disabled people like myself exist at the boundary of ability and disability, we tend to be excluded from both spaces, but our existence in this liminal space challenges the construction of disability as separate from and lesser than ability. Okay, so MECFS is described by the Center for Disease Control as a disabling and complex illness associated with the following experiences. People with MECFS are often not able to do their usual activities. At times, MECFS may confine them to bed. People with MECFS have overwhelming fatigue that is not improved by rest. MECFS may get worse after any activity, whether it's physical or mental. This symptom is known as post-exertional malaise. Other symptoms can include problems with sleep, thinking and concentrating, pain and dizziness, and people with MECFS may not look ill. So Sorry, my cats are here with me. You might hear them in the background. So I experience most of these things. I'm tired most of the time. I have aches and pains, brain fog, difficulty concentrating, and post-exertional malaise. I also experience positive effects of ME/CFS, such as privileged insight into ableist oppression, heightened compassion, and meaningful relationships with other disabled people. But these positive experiences do not count towards the medical definition of ME/CFS, so I won't focus on them in this talk, although I have discussed them at length elsewhere, including on biopolitical philosophy. But today I will focus on the exclusions that I and many other people face due to the dominant neoliberal definition of disability. Okay. So the CDC notes that researchers have not yet found what causes ME/CFS, and there are no specific laboratory tests to diagnose ME/CFS directly. An estimated 836,000 to 2.5 million Americans suffer from ME/CFS, but about 90% of people with ME/CFS have not been diagnosed. Eleanor Alexandra Byrne adds that since no biomarker or causal mechanism has been uncontroversially identified for ME/CFS, the status of people with chronic fatigue is unclear. This poses many epistemic challenges. So doctors are reluctant to diagnose people with ME/CFS due to skepticism, both about the credibility of their testimony and about whether or not ME/CFS is even a legitimate illness category. So these forms of epistemic marginalization present barriers to diagnosis and services that require medical certification. Okay, so I'll talk about some of the exclusions that sort of ambiguously disabled people can face. And I'm just focusing here on the American context and American policy for this presentation. So, but I think it generalizes. So similar, you could say similar things about Canada and a lot of countries. Okay, so due to these factors, people with ME/CFS face barriers to a range of formal and informal support systems, including disability benefits, educational accommodations, and even acceptance in the disabled community. So I'll elaborate on these exclusions in this part of the talk. On the first point, most people with ME/CFS don't qualify for disability benefits, which require a diagnosis corroborated by medically acceptable clinical and laboratory findings, according to the Social Security Administration. The SSA emphasizes that symptoms alone cannot be the basis for a finding of disability. Neither of these conditions is met in most cases of ME/CFS. The SSA also stipulates that applicants must be unable to do any substantial gainful work activity because of a medical condition that has lasted or can be expected to last for at least 12 months. Yet many people with ME/CFS can do some work. I myself have taught one university course per semester for the last 3 years, which makes me ineligible for benefits. So second, many people with ME/CFS don't qualify for educational accommodations, which typically require some kind of professional certification. So the University of Missouri St. Louis, where I currently work, is a case in point. Disability Access Services at University of Missouri St. Louis disclaims that it cannot provide accommodations to students without verifiable supporting documentation from a qualified professional. Yet a medical diagnosis is unavailable to an estimated 90% of people with ME/CFS, while other forms of documentation can be just as difficult to obtain. This poses significant problems for young people, that is most university students, especially since, as the CDC explains, ME/CFS is often thought of as a problem in older adults, and not much is known about ME/CFS in children under 18 because there have been few studies in this age group. As a result, equal access to education, which is guaranteed by most universities and colleges, is not available to most students with ME/CFS. Third, People with ME/CFS are not recognized as disabled by some members of the disabled community because ME/CFS is widely assumed to be an impairment rather than a disability due to its association with physical pain. So on the social model of disability, as described by one of its founders, Michael Oliver, disability and impairment are completely separate phenomena. Quote, disablement is nothing to do with the body, while impairment is nothing less than a description of the physical body. So because ME/CFS ranges from uncomfortable to painful, it's often assigned to the category of impairment alone. In fact, at a disability conference at which I presented in 2020, someone asked how we are to distinguish between disabilities like deafness and impairments like ME/CFS, which implied that I probably shouldn't have been invited to present at a conference intended for disabled people. So being excluded from the disabled community means being denied resources that could help to mitigate other forms of exclusion, like denials of disability benefits and accommodations. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some solutions inspired by Marxist feminism. So what is the best way to address these forms of ableist exclusion? One possibility would be for people with ME/CFS to advocate for more diagnostic testing and better access to benefits, accommodations, and peer support. This, however, is an individualistic strategy that would work only for the most unambiguous cases, those with discernible biomarkers of illness and an inability to work for an income. Worse, it could incite the Social Security Administration to impose even stricter restrictions on benefits to protect taxpayer dollars, as it has been doing for the last 10 years. So better access to diagnoses and services also wouldn't necessarily help people with ME/CFS gain access to the disabled community, because a diagnosis could just be taken to confirm that ME/CFS is an impairment as opposed to a disability. Instead, the social model of disability in its paradigmatic form would need to be challenged. In addition, individual or diagnostic solutions fail to address the underlying biopolitical causes of the exclusions discussed here, including the capitalistic scarce resources ideology that favors austerity measures and gatekeeping rather than transformative change. So as disabled blogger Rosie Pacey observes, stealing resources is where the ableist narrative about who counts as disabled intersects with austerity. Austerity tells us that there's only enough money in the pot to help those with the very worst conditions. It tells us that we're not disabled enough, and to say otherwise would be to steal limited resources from those who really need it. Okay, so Shelley Tremaine further elaborates on how totalizing definitions of disability create fault lines within the disabled community. So she writes, a disabled people's movement that grounds its claims to entitlement in the identity of its subject can expect to face similar criticisms to the feminist movement from an ever-increasing number of constituencies that feel excluded from and refuse to identify with those demands for rights and recognition. In addition, minorities internal to the movement will predictably pose challenges to it, the upshot of which are that those hegemonic descriptions of disability eclipse their respective particularities. So in light of this, I think that an adequate solution to the gatekeeping of disability, which is itself a byproduct of neoliberal capitalism, must contradict the neoliberal construction of disability as a diagnosable illness that impairs wage-generating productivity. So demanding equal access to economic supports, accommodations, and peer support wouldn't necessarily challenge this oppressive model. In a sense, it would sort of contribute to this very rigid definition of disability, actually. Okay, so some proposals for Marxist feminism. So I want to suggest that a better strategy can be found in Marxist feminism's response to patriarchal capitalism. Marxist feminism emerged as a response to the exclusion of women from certain sectors of the economy, workmen's compensation, welfare, and other benefits. In the first half of the 20th century, only 20% of women were classified by the Census Bureau as gainful workers, and only 5% of married women belonged to this category. Women who did enter the workforce were paid less than half as much as men on average. So this resembles disabled people's situation today, in which only 20% of disabled people participate in the workforce, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and many who do are paid a sub-minimum wage of as little as pennies an hour. And I'll also note that racism plays a role in these disparities, with women of color making less money than white women across the 20th century due to the double race-gender wage gap. And today, while it's difficult to obtain data on racial disparities in Social Security decisions, recent studies do indicate that Black claimants and claimants who do not speak fluent English are denied benefits more often than white and native English-speaking claimants. So this shows that race and ethnicity intersect with gender and disability to compound the exclusions faced by multiply oppressed disabled people. So Marxist feminism provides a blueprint for how to address these barriers to public resources that are particularly experienced by the most oppressed people. So, okay, so I referenced The Problem with Work by Kathy Weeks, and there's a picture of the book on the slide, and it's basically a glass office building with workers inside. So I want to suggest that a better strategy can be found in Marxist feminism's response. Oh, sorry, one second. Okay. Yes, okay, so in The Problem with Work, Kathy Weeks analyzes and ultimately rejects two early wave feminist responses to patriarchal capitalism. The first strategy was to accept the lesser value accorded to unwaged domestic labor and seek to secure women's equal access to work. So the thought was that wage labor would liberate women from mandatory domestic service and grant them financial independence. The second strategy was to revalue unwaged forms of household-based labor, from housework to caring work, by redefining these domestic activities as productive work. And this strategy took the form of a demand for wages for housework. Both strategies challenge the notion that women's labor is a private service to the family, whereas men's labor is real work that contributes to the nation's GDP. Okay. However, both strategies failed to challenge the dominant legitimating discourse of work. So the first proposal sought to incorporate women into the exploitative, alienating workforce, while the second sought to expand the logic of the workplace into the home. So they expand the scope of work. Neither proposal challenged the capitalist mode of production, the necessity of producing surplus labor for employers at the expense of the workers' autonomy, the valorization of work as a moral duty, or the vilification of non-workers. Today, women make more money but work harder than ever, often bearing the double burden of wage labor and a significant portion of unpaid care work. And this has incited many feminists to reject the value of neoliberal or girl boss feminism. So, as an alternative to these early wave proposals, Weeks defends the refusal to work as a model of resistance, both to the modes of work that are currently imposed on us and to their ethical defense in the productivist work ethic. So the refusal to work more specifically challenges both the exploitative and alienating nature of work and the compulsoriness of work. Yes, so Weeks suggests that the refusal to work can be realized. So Weeks suggests that the refusal to work can be realized in two policies that more effectively address the problems targeted by first and second wave feminism's demands. The first is an unconditional universal basic income, sufficient to liberate people from the need to work, while enhancing the bargaining power of workers by allowing them to refuse unsatisfactory work contracts. So with UBI, people would work for a wage only if and when they see fit. The second proposal is a 30-hour full-time work week with no decrease in pay compared to the 40-hour work week. And this would liberate workers to imagine post-capitalist futures, to enjoy unstigmatized rest and relaxation, and to cultivate new roles and relationships outside of the capitalist matrix. So rather than demanding more work for more pay, this strategy demands less work for more pay. Another advantage of the anti-work approach from a feminist perspective is that it disrupts the production of gender dualisms and hierarchies that privilege patriarchal masculinity. So as Weeks observes, labor relations produce not only distinct classes, but also distinct genders. She writes, "The gendering of work is not just a matter of the gender division of both household roles and waged occupations, but a consequence of the ways that workers are often expected to do gender at work. Gender is put to work when, for example, workers draw upon gendered codes and scripts as a way to negotiate relationships with bosses and coworkers, to personalize impersonal interactions, or to communicate courtesy, care, professionalism, or authority to clients, students, patients, or customers." So in short, capitalist labor relations produce highly regimented gender roles, which marginalize women as well as non-binary subjects. Women are a subordinate gender in the work regimented gender matrix, and non-binary people are excluded from that matrix altogether. When non-binary people enter the workforce, they're seen as a problem for employers because they require different dress codes, bathrooms, pronoun policies, and other changes to the standard business model that conflict with capitalism's need for efficiency and cost cutting. So the refusal to work represents a refusal to complacently submit to the binary, hierarchical, and exclusionary rules and regulations of the workplace and its limited range of existential possibilities for workers. It also opens up post-work spaces in which we can playfully reimagine gender and social identity in general. So these proposals, I think, can also be applied to the exclusions and barriers imposed on disabled people, particularly those with ambiguous, or I would even call queer, boundary crossing disabilities like MECFS. Okay, so here are some proposed solutions influenced by Marxist feminism. So the first is a universal basic income sufficient to support a comfortable lifestyle. And this would liberate disabled people from the need to apply for disability benefits. Everyone would receive a basic income regardless of ability or disability status. In addition, a shorter and more flexible work week would allow more disabled people to participate in the workforce if they so choose, since shorter shifts are more manageable for a variety of bodies, including those with chronic fatigue. So those are taken right from Marxist feminism. In terms of education, the refusal to work, at least within the normal parameters, could be realized in universal design and ungrading. So universal design is the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. Universal design strives to make accommodation superfluous by designing education to be accessible to all. So the implementation of universal design in higher education would address the unequal workload and unnecessary stress that standard accommodation policies cause. Okay, and second, ungrading is another work-reducing strategy that could be particularly useful to disabled people. So ungrading refers to the policy of eliminating or significantly reducing the number of mandatory graded assignments per class and using alternative grading schemes like self-assessment. So this reduces the need for accommodations by reducing workloads and giving students more control over their education. And grades, as Jesse Stommel describes them, function as currency for a capitalist system that reduces teaching and learning to a mere transaction. So grades function basically to extract productivity from students, often driving them to exert themselves to the point of exhaustion. So ungrading liberates students from the need to live up to an imposed standard of productivity and offers them more time for rest, relaxation, and play. Okay, finally, in terms of the disabled community and peer support, so within the disabled community, the refusal to work could be realized in the refusal to demand evidence of illness, pathology, and other markers of real disability from disabled people. Since these demands create more work, competition, and anxiety within the community and in society at large. And not only are such demands taxing, but they also erase the variability of disabled people's experience by, quoting Shelley Tremaine again, positing disability as a pre-existing and stable entity. However, disabilities are intersubjectively variable and historically contingent phenomena. So this applies to MECFS, which has diverse presentations and clinical courses and can vary widely from one person to the next. Moreover, the term MECFS didn't even exist until the 1950s and didn't receive widespread recognition until the 1980s, when it was disparagingly referred to as Raggedy Ann syndrome and yuppie flu in the media. So MECFS, like other forms of disability and the concept of disability itself, is a historically and culturally specific and contingent social phenomenon, a complex apparatus of power rather than a natural attribute or property that certain people possess. So again, that's from Tremaine's analysis of disability. So Marxist feminist strategies essentially are useful, I think, because they refute capitalism's totalizing and ahistorical definition of disability by refusing to reduce disability to a pathology or productivity impairing illness. Marxist feminism also challenges the ability-disability binary that treats ability and disability as distinct and oppositional categories. And this binary contributes to the exclusion of ambiguously disabled people from both institutional resources that they may need and full access to peer support. Okay. Okay, so finally, a final point on the value of Marxist feminist solutions. Anti-work strategies disrupt the capitalistic construction of disability as a productivity impairing pathology. So if everyone receives a universal basic income sufficient to liberate them from both poverty and the need to work, if a multiplicity of bodies can participate in the paid workforce, if accommodationist policies are replaced by universal design principles, then disability will no longer be a marker of public dependency, poverty, and social disutility. Universal basic income would be paid to non-disabled and disabled people alike, and disabled people would be more integrated into the paid workforce. In contrast, advocating for better access to conditional benefits, accommodations, and peer support, to which disabled people are, I should emphasize, entitled, this won't disrupt the capitalist definition of disability as a threat to the moral and economic viability of society. So just as the wages for housework movement and the masculine-feminine binary reinforced the perception of women as domestic servants, the capitalist model of disability tacitly reinforces both the negative perception of disability as a moral and economic risk and the ability-disability binary that underwrites this conception. So anti-work policies disrupt both of these binaries by rebuking work culture and its rigid class, gender, and disability formations. So the refusal to work basically liberates us from preconceived notions about social identity and social class, and creates post-work spaces in which to play with the concepts of gender, disability, and other social identities. Okay, so in sum, people with ME/CFS are largely excluded from the receipt of benefits, accommodations, and peer support. The simple solution to these exclusions is to pursue better access to diagnoses and 1, 2, and 3. Yet Marxist feminism suggests an alternative strategy, namely that we refuse to comply with the logic of capitalism by demanding freedom from work, an unconditional basic income, a shorter work week, and universally accessible spaces. Implementation of these policies would liberate us from oppressive governmental bureaucracies and more broadly from the capitalistic conception of disability as a diagnosable set of negative symptoms. Further, these policies, if implemented, would create non-work spaces in which to play with disability outside of the dualisms imposed on us under capitalism. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mich. We should give a hearty round of applause. I will start. You can see the camera. You'll see I'm not Tommy. You can also hear that I'm not Tommy. Tommy, unfortunately, had to go to an urgent meeting, and so I'm going to take the questions in the Q&A. And I see we have the first question from Amadine. So let me read this out. Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. A couple of clarification questions. First, would you say that ME/CFS becomes a disability due to capitalist expectations of work and productivity? So in a post-capitalist society that would be based on the changes you recommend, it would no longer be a disability. Second, could you say more about how ungrading works? If it relies on self-assessment, how can students who are still learning accurately self-assess? This is a pragmatic rather than a skeptical question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great questions. So this is based on my chapter in Shelley Tremaine's edited volume and this presentation. And I excluded a big part on the socio-historical construction of disability under capitalism. That part is very influenced by Sarah Rose's book, No Right to Be Idle, where she explains how disability, our modern conception of disability, was created under conditions of industrial capitalism in which certain bodies were excluded from the labor force. So that's partly because workplaces were designed specifically to accommodate people who were considered able-bodied, but also because employers essentially excluded disabled people because of worries about having to pay workers' compensation and things like this, and because of increasing stigma around disability. But Sarah F. Rose writes about how our modern conception of disability as basically a bodily impairment that hinders a person's ability to participate in the workforce emerged under industrial capitalism. So I'm trying to challenge that conception, which is, of course, inherently negative and places disabled people in a subordinate social position where they essentially, depend on conditional welfare and are seen as an economic risk and social burden. So this is the negative effect of this neoliberal construction of disability. Essentially as this like risk factor more than anything else. So I'm challenging that definition. Now, in a post-capitalist future, would chronic fatigue syndrome be a disability? Because this would disrupt our current definition of disability. So, we think a disabled person qualifies for disability benefits paradigmatically. And so they have these biomarkers of underlying illness, they're impaired, they can't work. In a post-capitalist future, I think it's hard for me to answer this question, but disability would look very different. And Marxist feminists will say gender would look very different in a post-capitalist society. We wouldn't have the rigid gender binary that we do, which is enforced by workplace protocols. But they often say it's hard to imagine what gender would be, or if it would exist. So yeah, it's hard for me to answer, like, would chronic fatigue syndrome be a disability in a post-capitalist society? I can't really say that, but I can say that we should try to disrupt the neoliberal construction of, of disability that we have that is very, exclusionary and oppressive. And then as to ungrading, so one of the main philosophical champions of ungrading is named Jesse Stommel, and he's written a lot of articles and blog posts on this practice. And ungrading, I didn't have a chance to fully explain it and do it justice, but it basically involves reducing mandatory graded assignments and giving students more control over the curriculum. So the teacher is supposed to speak with students and consult with them about how they want the course to go. So like what kinds of assignments do students want? What kind of grading scheme do students want? And so it involves a dialogue where students are sort of empowered to take control over and even sort of personalize their own curriculum. So because it's more flexible, it would be more accommodating to a range of a range of bodies, a range of differently positioned people. So the good thing about ungrading is really that it's more flexible and responsive to students' needs.
So I see Aladine has put the link to Jesse Stommel's FAQ in the chat there. So many things to ask about that, but I will restrain myself and move on to Maeve's question. So Maeve says, "Hi Mitch, I really like your suggestion of changing the material conditions of work through UBI or a shorter working week. But do you think that we also need to challenge the stigma around disability, whereby people with visible and hidden ambiguous disabilities are seen as not fit for work? Even if these material changes enable more disabled people to work, other workers might not want to work with them or employers to employ them."
Yes, I agree. So even if more disabled people enter the workforce, there will still be stigma against disability. I'm sure, because it's largely ideological at this point. There is ideological stigma around disability. So it's not just a matter of material conditions. But I think but the question, hold on. Sorry, could you repeat the first part of the question?
So the question's in the Q&A, so you can see it.
Yeah.
You see the text yourself there in the Q&A.
Yes, we need to challenge the stigma. Yes, I definitely think that we need to challenge the stigma. So I think that part of the reason for the stigma is the fact that to be considered disabled, according to the Social Security Administration, to be disabled and deserving of disability benefits, you have to be unfit for work. Like, you are defined as unfit for work. If you work, then you're not disabled by definition, according to that government office. So that increases the stigma around disability. One of the things that Sarah F. Rose says is that disabled people have always worked. They have always been able to work, but they were forcibly excluded from the labor force because of both the way the labor force was constructed, but also essentially ideological reasons. So just not wanting to accommodate them. So during the Industrial Revolution, a lot of employers were worried about being seen as having unsafe working conditions. And a lot of them did have unsafe working conditions, especially workplaces that employed a predominantly Black or female workforce. Those tended to be particularly unsafe. And so employers wanted to avoid liability. So they would basically blame and scapegoat disabled workers. They would say, those workers are irresponsible, it's not our fault. So that reinforced the notion that disabled people are, irresponsible, socially costly. And then to fully avoid liability, they just stopped hiring them at all. They just didn't want to hire disabled people because they didn't want to be seen as, having unsafe working conditions that could disable someone. So to reduce the stigma, I do think we have to eliminate this false conception that disabled people can't work, they're not fit for work, they're irresponsible workers. And I think these are all, artifacts of the capitalist economy. So we have to reduce that conception. So making the workplace more flexible, having fewer hours, that could help to reduce the stigma. Also, there's a stigma created. So something else that Sarah F. Rose says is that Social Security increases the stigma too, because workers are pushed out of the workforce and forced into public dependency. So now they're seen as a burden. So, all of these political choices resulted in the stigmatization of disability. So yes, what I'm proposing is we need to stop, so because UBI would be available to everyone, it would reduce that, conception that it's for disabled people. Like, welfare is for disabled people. They have to be on welfare, which is false. I basically want to restructure the workforce and the way that the workforce and welfare function. So I think, so I'm proposing for transformative change to reduce that stigma. Sorry, I hope that wasn't too long.
Great. No, that was excellent. So I should have told my fellow panelists that they cannot, for technical reasons, write in the Q&A. So if you'd like to ask a question, use the raise hand function or just come on camera and shout. But in the meantime, I'll ask one of the many questions I have. So it was very interesting to see you draw on Marxist feminist writing, but there's another Marxist semi-tradition, I suppose, maybe not much of a tradition. I'm thinking of the work of Paul Gomberg, who has argued for human beings having the fundamental right to make a contribution to the lives of others. And so one thing that happens in many communities is people just are not given the opportunity to make a contribution to the life of others. And whilst I'm some days very favorable to UBI, I wonder whether UBI will give governments a sort of easy get out in a way, and saying that you can be paid to stay at home, you can be paid to be a consumer, and that contributing and constructive part of one's life may not appear. I mean, you see the point.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So one of the reasons that Kathy Weeks supports anti-work Marxist feminism, as opposed to other forms that only target the alienation and immiseration caused by work. So she actually targets the compulsoriness of work. So one of the reasons she favors that anti-work form of Marxism is because work defines us as people in a capitalist society. So it's just too all-encompassing. Like, we need to be liberated from the all-consuming ideology of work culture so that we can, explore our humanity, our existential possibilities, our gender, our disability on our own terms that are independent of the capitalist matrix. So within a capitalist society, one of the reasons I talk about the importance of play, which is central to anti-work feminism and queer theory, is because capitalism is so rigid. It's against leisure time, it's against play, it's against creativity, it's stultifying, it's alienating. But if we have these post-work spaces, we can play with these concepts and change them. But I see what you're saying about, people want to have jobs because jobs are the main way that we, I guess, like, participate in society in a capitalist economy. But it doesn't have to be that doesn't have to be how we participate in society. That doesn't have to be how we define ourselves, how we form relationships. Like, yes, our relationships tend to revolve around the workplace, but why should they? So yeah, I actually think that it's not a good thing that we feel like, to have value as people, to have an identity, we have to be workers. So yeah, so I think that that's actually the fact that we feel we have a right to work, like, we need to work to have dignity, to have a social role. That's actually pretty toxic, So yeah, yeah, and again, I just want to reiterate that disabled people are entitled to participate in all social institutions and the economy. But the reason I like anti-work feminism is because, I just don't think work should be mandatory, all-consuming, that it should, define us. And I was just thinking recently, there's one point on which I agree with Elon Musk. And it's that he supports UBI. And the reason he does is because so many jobs are being automated, and he's trying to automate work. So he thinks that everyone's going to need UBI because all the jobs are going to be automated. So people just won't be able to participate in the economy. And then non-disabled people will, get a sense of what it feels like to be disabled and economically excluded. But yeah, I mean, there is a possibility that UBI is just going to be required because of automation. But anyways, sorry, I'm going on a bit of a tangent. But yes, I think that so I think that we shouldn't have to define ourselves by our job, essentially, is the point.
Okay, so I'm sure Paul would agree with you actually on that, but so there's a question now from Ray Briggs. Can you speak to the role of the state in distributing UBI? I agree with your deep distrust of our practice of putting employers in charge of people's lives, but can you speak to my distrust of the state having that power? I'm especially worried about the state having the power to withhold or revoke someone's income if the prevailing political ideology shifts that way.
Yeah. So in Iris Marion Young's famous essay on oppression, she writes about how relying basically to depend on the state for money is like a paradigmatic form of oppression, because you're basically subservient to these bureaucratic mechanisms. And you have to go through this sort of bureaucratic morass in order to gain the resources that you are entitled to. So this is certainly a problem with government bureaucracy. But I feel UBI, I feel and I hope that UBI is preferable to disability benefits, because disability benefits, they're only for essentially like a very, a minority of disabled people, essentially, because the requirements, especially in the US, are so strict. So many people don't qualify, especially people with disabilities like chronic fatigue syndrome or anything that is seen as medically ambiguous. So I feel universal basic income would at least be more accessible. There is the problem of bureaucracy, but I feel that there's less bureaucracy with like a UBI check that would go to everyone, as opposed to disability benefits that you have to apply to. And so many applications are rejected, especially by, a lot of minority applicants. So I'm hoping that this proposal will reduce the bureaucratic red tape.
Okay, well, thanks so much. And I'm afraid we're out of time now. So let's thank Mich one more time, and we reassemble in 10 minutes time, 5 minutes past the hour, whichever hour you have. I have 3 o'clock, but I think there are those with whom it's more likely to be 9 o'clock in the morning. Anyway, thank you so much, Mich.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
And we'll be back in 10 minutes time.
Okay, great.
So the participants can go through backstage.